And we're back. This is part 2 of day 4 for NSCI 306. Switch over here to our lecture notes. We're going to continue looking at using evidence, specifically in terms of scientific arguments. So I want to draw here on the They Say, I Say chapter on writing and science. And I think it's a really useful summary of how this could work and applies the basic model well. I like the point that the author makes to start off with, that scientific writing is fundamentally argumentative because scientists make and defend claims, they address disagreements and explore unanswered questions, they propose novel mechanisms and new theories, and they advance certain explanations and reject others. I said this on the first day of class, but it bears repeating. Science does not just let the data speak for itself, or depending on who you read, the data speak for themselves, if data is plural. There's always an argument involved. And so even if we're emphasizing, here's the data that I collected, here's the way that I'm approaching it, here's the way that I'm analyzing it, it helps to foreground that argument process so we can understand how others are using those mechanisms and how we can use them to advance our own writing. So those of you who are writing in fields other than natural science, some of this may be a little bit less relevant, but I think it will be helpful to grasp the readings we're doing this quarter. And a lot of it does, I think, transfer over to other scholarship. So I'm going to finish up this lecture by looking at a case study of that. But before we get there, I want to go through some of the model here. So here's the #1 most common template you're going to see in scholarly writing, especially in science. Although previous work suggests X, our data show Y. This is the basic setup for a novel contribution to a given field. A lot of the time in undergraduate classes, we don't worry so much about producing completely new arguments or producing new data or anything, just because it's usually not practical or realistic to expect. If you're new to a field, or if you've only been studying this for 3 or 4 classes, for example, then it would be unfair to say, okay, I want you to come up with a completely new idea, something that contributes specifically to how we understand how physics or chemistry or whatever works. Those of you who are in grad school, though, know that as you make that transition to professional writing, professional academic writing, you have to add that in. So if you are looking forward in your career and thinking about a graduate degree, or even thinking about writing something like a senior thesis, it's good to organize your work in terms of, here's what others have done, and here's what's new or interesting or significant about the change that we're making here, the new stuff that we have presented. I also like this idea, so on page 207 of They Say, I Say, points out that the objective tone of scientific writing can obscure its argumentative nature, and many textbooks reinforce a non-argumentative vision of science when they focus on accepted conclusions and ignore ongoing controversies. And I see this a lot when I teach this course. Many of you in your, your first self-evaluations pointed out that you're used to writing basically, so here are just the facts about what happened in this lab session. Or this is just what my impression of this play or this other thing, whatever you have to write about in your major. And maybe argument is not front and center there, or analysis is not particularly emphasized. That is going to be something to adjust to in this course. But I think it starts by pointing out, or maybe not pointing out is the wrong term, maybe just recognizing that everything you see is a form of argument. That every author has made a series of rhetorical choices to present certain data, to frame it a certain way, and to show what is significant about that, regardless of how they interpret it or how much they say. Because we are in many ways a data-driven culture. We want to see the numbers. Right now, everyone is checking incessantly to see what are the infection rates for COVID-19, where are most of the cases, when can we potentially, actually leave home and go out to dinner or go see a movie or go get a haircut. And oftentimes the numbers help elucidate that. but the numbers are only as useful as the frameworks around them. Remember the Thomas Sowell quote I opened the quarter with, facts divorced from visions are mere isolated curiosities. So let's look at how those isolated curiosities form arguments. First thing you want to think about in any scientific paper is how are you going to engage the data in front of you? And data can come in many different forms. If you're doing an experiment, you've got lab data, but it can also be, I read this story, or I watched this play, or I observed these people, I took this survey, and I'm going to analyze how that works. The author of the chapter points out that data are crucial to scientific argumentation, but they're not the end of the story. And I like this point because it comes back to the controlling metaphor of the book, which is conversation. That when we have new data, we don't just say, well, that happened. We did this experiment. Say, all right, is this reliable? Is this the right kind of data for the questions we're asking? What conclusions can we draw here? And what does this mean moving forward? Has this changed how we should act or think about this issue? If we figure out that this kind of mask is this effective in preventing the spread of COVID-19, then should we make everyone wear this particular kind of mask? Or should we do further experiments to say there could be other variables here? Or we say, well, what makes a difference here? What else could we investigate? And what's our next step? And this is why a lot of studies will end up with a section called future work. It's not just the academics saying, you know what, I need a job after this. They do. But it's them saying, here's what this suggests about the field and what we could learn and what we could produce in the future. And that's actually a step I'll ask you to make in your second paper, which we'll talk about later on this quarter. The author goes on to point out that scientific writers synthesize data. Again, this is a step you'll do in paper 2. Propose novel theories and design the next set of experiments. This is what I was just talking about in terms of doing future work. Scientific progress depends on the insight and creativity that scientists bring to their data. The thrill of doing science and writing about it comes from the ongoing struggle to use data to better understand our world. And this is sort of a nice approach, I think, particularly for those of us like me who are not trained in lab science in particular. It's been a long, long time since my biology lab, and even longer since my chemistry lab. But it points out that scientists still act as humans. They analyze information using their own insight, their own ideas, and they have to do it creatively. So it's not just, we're going to do the same process that everyone else has done over and over. It's asking questions like, why do we do it that way? Why is it important to have this experiment setting, or to use only this kind of data, or to ask only these survey questions? What would happen if we did this differently? If we asked these other people, if we did this outside instead of inside, if we bombarded this chemical instead of that chemical? It's that move to creativity that maybe makes it a little easier to see the creative writing part of it. Now, it may not be creative writing in the sense of characters and plot twists and images and symbolism and all the stuff you tried to forget from high school literature class, but it's still creative in how you put together that argument. It is still rhetorical in how you're making those claims and how you are defending them. So let me show you how context makes a difference in how we present data. This is from a commentary published in November 2018. This is around the time of the last midterm elections for Congress. And this is from the Century Foundation. They label themselves a progressive, nonpartisan think tank, which basically means they're pretty far left politically. And this is the title of their article: Trump claims the economy is the best ever. These 11 facts tell a different story. And this came across my news feed several months back, and I saved it because I thought this is a really good example of how the rhetoric of science, in this case economics, tends to mask the idea of even making an argument by saying, look, it's just the facts telling the story. Literally, that's what they're saying in this article. So I'm going to show you the article in a minute, but take a look at how they set this up. So in their introduction. They say there's been a great deal of political and media attention paid to the rate of economic growth under the Trump administration during 2017 and 2018, of course, when the article was written. Trump has often called the results under his administration unprecedented, and he's still actually saying that. Watch the daily news conferences. He'll say, we had the greatest economy. It was the best economy of all time. I was the best economist of all time. I was the greatest. I beat Muhammad. Okay, he doesn't say he beat Muhammad Ali, but you've seen this speech many, many times. Here's their claim about it. His statements are unfounded. While wage growth has been strong, most other measures of economic growth under the current administration are less impressive than they were during the tail end of the previous administration, Barack Obama's second term. So these are the terms in which they're going to investigate. This is the data they're going to pull out. But notice they're already putting this in a particular rhetorical, in this case, a political context. They're going to say the media has claimed this, Trump has said this, and while this part, the wage growth, does match up with his narrative, actually the rest of it shows a different story, and they're going to specifically contrast that with Obama's results. They further say this as they wrap up the introduction, say as election day nears, so the midterm elections I mentioned was the context for this, we've dug into the last 4 years, spanning the end and beginning of two different sets of executive leadership, and now let the facts speak for themselves. By comparing the rate of growth of key economic variables in the last years of the Barack Obama administration to the record thus far in the Trump administration, we present a report card on results under the two presidents. I want to highlight a couple of things here. In that last sentence, notice the analogy, the report card. Can you think of a better way to indicate these are, theoretically at least, objective reports? Because especially if you grew up and you went to school in the US, you've gotten a report card at some point. And maybe you look forward to that, and maybe you say, I don't know if I really want to open that, or you're really scared, like your parents had to see it and sign it or something like that. And so by using that metaphor creatively, right, they say we are distilling the information into something that summarizes how well these two presidents have been doing, these two administrations. And they echo that language at the start of that quote. This is not just two periods of economic growth or contraction or recession, or whatever terms you want to use here, but two different sets of executive leadership. And this is a very loaded claim because it suggests that this is not just how the economy has behaved, but it's how have specifically President Obama and President Trump led this. What have they done by implication or and by actual things to create these results? But of course, the main thing, and the reason this jumped out at me, is this phrase right here. We're going to now let the facts speak for themselves. The same move they made in their title, the facts tell a different story, and a completely misleading claim, because they're not going to let the facts speak for themselves. Already, they have put this in a particular rhetorical context, particular historical context, a particular political context. And even if you didn't know anything about the Century Foundation before you read this, by the time you get through this, you have a pretty good sense of where they stand and why they're going to make this argument that Obama had a better economic record than Trump. So let me actually look at how this went. I'm going to switch over the sharing here to the browser. Okay. So this is labeled commentary under economy and jobs. Excuse me. And here's our title. Trump claims the economy is the best ever. These 11 facts tell a different story. And we get a photo of Trump with his teleprompters. I wish he'd used the teleprompters more often. Not coincidentally with his hand raised in salute. You may remember there was a slight controversy about that particular salute in the 2016 primaries. This is the introduction I just read to you. But take a look here as we get into some of the charts. First of all, the charts have a color scheme. If you've read anything at all on US politics in the last, 20, 25 years, you've heard these terms: red state for Republican controlled and blue state for Democrat controlled. California is a deep blue state, but this is kind of entered in vocabulary that a blue state generally leans left, red state generally leans right, but maybe there are purple states or purple areas. Like in Texas, Texas is a red state, but Austin, Texas is definitely more liberal than the rest of Texas. And so it's kind of a purple or a blue area. And in fact, there are like campaigns that are like turn Texas blue. Not so many for turn California red, because that hasn't happened since Ronald Reagan. But these colors right away indicate the political context. And the labels, it's maybe a little bit hard to see on the video, but this says Trump administration and Obama administration. They want to show how they compare. So this is gross domestic product. And even visually, you can see that 2014 is better than 2017, and 2015 is better than 2018. 2016, well, 2016 was kind of a mess. Let's just agree on that. But right away, we get GDP. We also have stuff in the captions. Monthly job growth was higher under Obama than in Trump's first 2 years. So again, they're picking things that reflect well on Obama and poorly on Trump. These are average monthly job gains. And it is worth pointing out that these are the last 2 years of Obama's second term, 2014, well, last 3 years, 2014, 2016, and the first 2 years of Trump's term. So in things like the variables they choose to measure, here's unemployment rate, here's unemployment to population, or employment to population rate, and here's wage growth. They have cherry-picked data that's going to make their side look better. Notice here that the variable that they highlighted in their introduction, wage growth, they say, okay, yes, this was growing, but it's growing all through Obama's administration, the chart suggests, and then it stops growing, it slows down, they point out, in 2018 during Trump's term. And more importantly, this is the one where the Trump numbers are bigger, the racial pay gap. This is something that's likely going to matter to a lot of their more progressive readers. This is the difference in weekly median earnings for white men and black men. And they say it was low in 2015, very low in 2016. And look at that, 2017, 2018. If you just had this chart, you might say, wow, the economy was really racist under Trump versus Obama. That would be kind of a stupid interpretation, but stranger interpretations have happened. And so as you go through, you look at variable after variable where they try to debunk the overall claim that Trump has made about economic progress. The federal deficit is growing rapidly under Trump, they point out. This has honestly been a big problem under every administration for the past 25 years or so, but that's a different soapbox for a different time. They point out that growth in worker productivity rose slowly under both, but it's still weak under Trump, which is a nice bit of rhetorical gymnastics saying, okay, our guy did this badly, but it's still bad under your guy. So they're reaching a little bit there. They bring in a direct quote here, growing like never before. This is Trump's words, of course. And they say, despite these massive corporate tax cuts, business investment isn't growing like never before. And as they finish up, they say, it's true, stocks are at the higher level. So yes, but stock prices grew faster after the re-elections of both Clinton and Obama. So they basically want to suggest that stocks were doing better before, after Democrats were elected, even though they are doing okay now. So they go all the way back to the late 90s for this data. This is Trump's first 710 days. And he's saying that it's actually was better in Obama's second term, weaker in Obama's first term. Here they throw in George W. Bush. Notice it was weaker than both of these. Significantly lower here. This is 2014. Yes, 2014, 15. And then way better under the Clinton economy in the late 90s. They don't, of course, point out who was in charge of Congress during those times, but that would complicate their narrative. Now, we could do soapboxing for a while on this, but my point is that even in an article that explicitly claims to let the facts speak for themselves, they don't. They contextualize the facts. They present them in certain ways. They use even colors and visual organization to make you think a certain way. And that's all legitimate. Those are all ways that can be really effective to get your point across. Let me go back to our notes. So just one example, but anytime you see an article claiming to let the facts speak for themselves, especially if it's a meme, look a little deeper into that. Okay, there we go. So now that we've seen an example of that, let me break down a structure for how you can both interpret scientific arguments and write your own, maybe a little bit down the road. You want to start with the they say, and I'll show you how this works in a few minutes. Your first step is to present the prevailing theories. What material, what viewpoints, what even equations have been used to analyze this first. And of course, here you want to focus on what is most relevant to your particular argument. But one thing you want to do, especially as you move on to more professional writing, is to contextualize your work. And to do that, you need to read pretty broadly. So when I was preparing for my dissertation, I did focus on my research area, my interest, which is in religious literature of 19th century America. But I also read a lot of other stuff on American literature, a lot of other stuff on religious literature more generally, maybe other fields or other countries, and just kind of stuff that would let me say, this is what I want to do, but this is why it's important for the larger field. Because there are like 10 people, maybe 12 people who work in my area. And if I just said, these 10 people are going to care about this, then my committee would say quite rightly, so what? Why should the rest of us read what you have to say? So you want to do that move. You want to say, what have other people said about this, and how can I use this to set up my own work? You also want to explain how the methods work here. Part of this is going to be looking at how you're setting up your approach, but it also helps to understand and potentially critique the methods other people have used. Because it might be that there's inconsistent data on the question you want to investigate. Or it might be that you suspect that things actually work one way, but all the data has shown the opposite result. Well, maybe one reason for that is that the techniques were inappropriate or the analysis was a little bit sloppy. And this could be a good way to compare and contrast what they've done. Finally, you want to summarize what they have found. In lab science, a lot of this is going to be quantitative. So you might need to throw some figures out there. Occasionally, maybe put a chart. I've seen, especially in dissertations, some authors will go through the literature review and then kind of do this big table of what previous authors have looked at, the key variables, what did they investigate, and then what were their main findings. And that helps them situate their work. It's going to be a balancing act because on one hand, you want to say this other work has been important, it's been significant, even if you don't think it was maybe done the right way. But on the other hand, you want to show that there's a gap there. So they've done this, but I want to do this. They've looked at this population, but I want to expand that. They've applied this model, but I want to do this better. As you move into the I say portion, then your first goal is, of course, just to present your results. As you go through the literature review, you're going to find that research gap. And there are a lot of ways you could look at that. We're going to come back to this question for paper 2, because that's going to be one of your tasks in that project. I like page 214 for some templates on this. This is basically a way to do something better. So maybe there's missing information on this group. Maybe you want to improve a way of doing this. That could be even on just the theoretical level, the mathematical level. Maybe you want to say, here's a better technique. Here's maybe a better method for analyzing the data, or a specific technique for doing this particular task. From there, you want to highlight what is new or particularly interesting about your data, because there's not going to be room to talk at length about everything that you found. In fact, a lot of studies will only be able to highlight particular results, just because there's not enough space to do that, to do justice to it in even the longer journal articles of, say, the 8,500 word length. This is often where you get into the discussion section. And so this is where you want to find what is going to be both representative and interesting. And this is usually something that is a novel contribution, something that advances that conversation. So where does this depart from either what you expected or what other models predicted, or from previous findings? One dissertation that I edited, the data was mostly observations and interviews with ESL students, adult ESL students in college classrooms. And the author was particularly looking at this idea of corrective feedback, which is a concept of saying, how do you explain that something was wrong? And it could be about, a vocabulary word in a language setting, or it could be, this isn't the right way to say this, or even I can't understand you. And how does that affect the learning process kind of more broadly? And so part of what the author did was she observed when and how often the different instructors use different techniques. How did they actually correct their students? Did they say, wait, let me stop you there. The word you need is this thing. It's not this other thing you said. Did they ask questions about that? Did they say, I'm sorry, say that again? And she saw that followed certain trends, most of which was what was expected from the previous literature or from her own hypotheses in the study. But she found that one of the instructors, the trends didn't hold. And they held actually in a negative way, or they didn't hold in a negative way, in that this instructor caused anxiety and anger and all these negative emotional responses among his students. And she wanted to know what happened here. And so she looked more closely at how he would handle a certain technique, a certain corrective feedback technique. And she found that there was a high correlation between the students reporting anxiety and the way he handled this technique. And so she looked at what was different between his approach and other instructors, and what can that teach us about how we should handle this. So it highlighted one small part. These are observations from one of 4 classrooms, and they were a relatively small part of all the things that she looked at and she analyzed that year. But she wrote 20 or so pages of the dissertation just on that case study to figure out, what does this make a difference and why is that important? So once you've highlighted those findings, then you want to go back in a discussion or a conclusion section and go back to the ways to respond that we looked at in the last lecture. Agree, disagree, or do both at once. So we looked at some templates there, giving the page numbers for the overall templates. And there's also a bit in this chapter on the science-specific templates. And this is just a way to say, here's where we differ productively, or here's how we extend previous work. Here's what we have done to make a difference in that conversation. Fourth, we're going to come back to this technique later this quarter, but you're going to anticipate and deal with objections. Figuring out what are those counter arguments is an important part of identifying your contributions. And sometimes you need to deal with them directly, deal with potential criticism. So this is called using a naysayer in the They Say, I Say book. We're going to come back to that chapter later on, so I don't want to get into it too much right now. Lastly, you're going to ask, so what, now what? Why does your work matter? What are the implications for maybe policymakers? What are the implications for how we understand this text or this author or this movement or this population? What have you done to advance knowledge in this field? What are your intellectual contributions? But also, what are the limitations? Because you can't design a perfect study. Maybe you decided, I'm going to gather data in this way through a survey. Okay? What do the survey questions capture? What don't they capture? Why did you do a survey versus interviews? How are there potential gaps in what you have done? And how can that predict future opportunities? This is the best way that I found to kind of couch this move in an academic paper, is to say, okay, here are the limitations that I recognize, I acknowledge. This is what this will let me do in the future. So it's like, think of in a sort of a job interview. Sometimes you get a question in a job interview, like, what's your greatest weakness and how are you going to use that as an opportunity for growth? Thinking in those terms can really help you spin weaknesses in your study or conclusion, say, this is what I'm going to do better next time. Want to close with this quote. I really like this one. On the frontiers of science, where we are probing questions that are just beyond our capacity to answer, the data are inevitably complete and controversy is to be expected. Writing about science presents the opportunity to add your own arguments to the ongoing discussion. And again, it's a very timely approach for this, because a lot of what's really important in scientific discussions on COVID-19 is on incomplete data. We just don't know a lot about how this works, the best way to treat it, the best way to contain it. We're gathering more information, we're doing more studies, but we have to work with what we have and then figure out the best ways to extend that to the policy questions. In the next couple of weeks, we'll probably see different states lifting restrictions in at different frequencies or to different degrees. Already some countries are getting back to work. But right now we have a big concentration of cases in New York. New York's going to be shut down for a while. California is probably going to be shut down for a while. North Dakota, maybe we'll be in a little better shape. Iowa, Illinois, hopefully there. So as you analyze those arguments and as you prepare your own arguments, think about how this structure could work. Let me conclude our time today by looking at a case study of this. This is from an article by these three authors called Laptop Multitasking Hinders Classroom Learning for Both Users and Nearby Peers. I rather like this article because I've been on both sides of the desk there. You know, I've had my laptop often during classes and much later when phones were actually smartphones, would occasionally have that out. I did try to keep at least the phone in my backpack when I was a student. But of course, as a teacher, I see this all the time. I've taught several classes in computer labs. And I still remember back several years ago, I was teaching at Columbus State Community College. And my mom came to visit me. And she had never actually seen me teach. So she sat in on one of my classes, and this is a computer lab. And she sat in the back. And I did my lecture discussion as usual. And after all the students had gone, she kind of walked up to me and said, I don't know how to tell you this, but a lot of your students were not paying attention to your lecture. They were on Facebook the whole time. Like, I know, Mom, that's kind of how college students work. And she seemed a little bit distressed by this. And I bring that up because this is sort of the motivation for the study that they did. They noticed that there were potential for disruption when students had their computers out, regardless of what they were actually working on. And so they wanted to measure, how this worked, both in terms of the students using the laptops and for their classmates. So let me pull up that article and show you just a few things about how they set this up. This PDF is on Blackboard, so we'll be reading it later on if you want to take a look at that. So I'm just going to focus on the introduction and literature review here. We're not going to go through the whole thing. But the abstract is a good starting point to get a sense of how the article works. And they point out that laptops are pretty much everywhere in university classrooms, even in big lecture halls. And they used this particular method. They used cognitive psychology theory on multitasking. So this idea that maybe if you try to do multiple things at once, it doesn't work quite as efficiently as you think it does. And so they examined the effects of in-class laptop use on student learning in a simulated classroom. Now, this is important because it could be a weakness in the data that they get. They're going to get different responses from students who are not actually in a class if they know they're in an experiment. But they explain later in the paper, in their methods section, why they chose to do it this way. And they kind of summarize their results here. But I want to highlight a few things on how they set this up. So even right off the bat, multitasking is ingrained in our daily lives. As you read this article, you may also be attending to a text message, sipping coffee, or writing out a list of to-dos. Or realistically, you may be listening to music, watching a few episodes of The Office on Netflix, and I don't know, recording a TikTok video. I really hope you're not trying to do all those things at once while you're doing your reading for 306, but I don't know. The theory, they point out, is this is intended to increase efficiency, but there are limitations to how well multiple tasks can be carried out concurrently, that is, at the same time. Multitasking places considerable demands on cognitive resources, which degrades overall performance as well as performance on each task in isolation. And so at this point, they're kind of setting up the general context for their study. They're saying, here's what we know overall about multitasking. Then they shift gears and they say, well, how does this work in education? Well, they point out that students are more commonly found engaged with their laptops or smartphones during class time. And so the current study investigated the effect of laptop multitasking on users and nearby peers in a classroom setting. So they do a lot of work in this first paragraph. They connect this to our overall experience as readers. We all multitask, and we try to multitask doing different things. They give examples of that. But they also point out that psychology research, which is their starting point, their field, has shown that there are limitations to how well this works because there are these certain cognitive resources. There are limits to how much we can think about and process at the same time. And then they go and say, we want to look at this in terms of classroom use of laptops because we think there might be an effect on students' learning. And from there, it gets kind of complicated. So I'm not going to go over every sentence here, but just take a look at how often they cite things here. Got 1, 2, 3, 4 citations just in this paragraph. And what they're doing is going over and summarizing a lot of previous work on this topic. So they bring in their technical terms, divided attention and dual task interference. They point out that there are limited resources available to attend to, process, encode, and store information for later retrieval. They look at how that process works in other studies. And they conclude that when we retrieve information that was processed via multitasking or with significant interruptions from a secondary task, we're more likely to experience some form of performance decrement, which basically means we remember stuff worse when we learned it during multitasking or when we got interrupted. Now, those of you who are working at home, living at home with your families, you probably know how this works firsthand because you probably had significant interruptions while you're trying to write a paper or do your homework or something like that. So they're looking at how that works cognitively in this particular context. Going on, more citations, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. They're doing a lot of reading to put this one paragraph together, but it lets them set up a particular context for the work that they want to set up here. As they move into their particular study, notice all this is on multitasking in general, they don't actually get to laptops until here, a few pages into the study. At this point, they start looking at more targeted research. So survey data claims that 99% of incoming freshmen own a laptop. 65% of students bring the laptops to class. I'm old enough that we didn't really have laptops. They weren't very common among students, but I had a Palm Pilot in college. And I was very proud of myself for figuring out how to put some of my readings for the day on my Palm Pilot, because I was taking a British literature course and it was like an 800-page anthology. So I just pulled up my Palm Pilot, which is actually maybe a little bit bigger than this thing, and had the poems for today's class right there. I thought, this is the new age. Yeah. And then there was a Kindle. The times we live in. So in the same way that they cited all these studies to set up their general claims about multitasking, they set up other studies to set up their claims about how laptops affect multitasking. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18 citations in this one fairly long paragraph. There's a lot of work, but that's because it's a literature review. They want to show they've done their homework, they've read all the stuff, and they are putting their work in the context of this. And some of this is showing previous results. So on one hand, they say, when used for academic purposes, such as taking notes and using software programs, in-class laptop use can increase satisfaction, motivation, and engagement among students. Good laptop. However, on the other hand, studies suggest that students who use laptops report low satisfaction with their education, are more likely to multitask, and are more distracted. Here's the thing that no teacher is ever surprised about. Student self-reports and classroom observations suggest that laptops are being used for non-academic purposes, such as instant messaging and playing games, checking email and watching movies, and browsing the internet. Yes, Mom, you were right. So this is the problem for their research context. Laptops on one hand can be useful tools. Laptops on the other hand can be really distracting. They want to do a cost-benefit analysis here. Are these distracting enough to justify keep using them for the potential academic advantages? As they go to describe their work, get into their design and their methods, they're still citing some sources, but notice this is kind of where the citations taper off. There's not a lot of citations here, just a couple there, but they do highlight Wood's findings are relevant but restricted in terms of the pedagogical recommendations that can be offered. One goal of the present study was to replicate these findings using a more controlled design and more stringent fidelity measures. So they're basically saying that the previous work was good and helpful, but they want to do a little bit better job here. And then they get into the actual experiments there. So we're going to come back to this study at the end of the quarter when we look at how to summarize and synthesize other people's work. We may go back over some of those passages, but I think it's a good taste of how some of those techniques work, because it shows how important and how central the literature review is to actually understanding where your study fits and how you can make those claims there. So evidence takes a lot of different forms here, and I hope you'll pay more attention as you're reading, not just to what arguments are being made, but how those claims are supported. Let me finish off by going over the week 3 homework, because it's going to change format just slightly. Rather than having a lecture or a discussion, on Tuesday, we will have our Paper 1 peer workshop. So your assignment for that day, take a couple of steps. First, you're going to upload your draft to the workshop folder under week 3. Notice there are 2 folders. One is labeled peer workshop, the other is labeled rough draft. You want the first one for this step, and your draft needs to be at least 700 words long to get credit. After you do that, you will evaluate 2 of your classmates' drafts. So if you upload your draft early, there may not be 2 to evaluate yet. Give it a couple of days and come back to that. The folder is open from April 7th to April 21st. So if you get the rough draft done early, then you can send stuff in and wait for that. Realistically, though, most stuff is not going to be in until later that day. So you'll do your peers a favor by getting stuff in earlier that day. Each evaluation, I believe there's 5 questions. I'm looking for 2 to 3 complete sentences for each one. So it's not just a, yes, I like this paper. No, I didn't like this paper. Good job on the thesis. That's not helpful. So you can refer to the instructions for details on that. The next day, on that Wednesday, you will revise your paper based on the feedback you got and then upload it to the Paper 1 rough draft folder. You can find that link in the week 3 lecture notes section or under major paper 1. It needs to be at least 800 words long. So you're going to add roughly half a page or so. But of course, the longer you can make it, the closer you'll be for the final draft. Once I get those, then I will start giving you written feedback. And that also probably is where we'll schedule our individual conferences to meet with me, go over that feedback. The second half of the homework for Thursday will be on rhetorical appeals. This is a fun class. So I'll be doing another video on that. And we're going to meet by Zoom on April 23rd to discuss the essays by Ben Goldacre. There's both on Big Pharma. So a different topic there. But it's a good case study of rhetorical appeals. You're going to complete an exercise on asking for money to practice this. So here are the instructions. You need $100 to cover an unexpected educational expense. You can decide what that is, however it would convince your audience. You're going to pick one of these audiences, your parents, your best friend, or your boss, and your job is to convince them to give you the money. You can decide how to set that up, whether you want this to be a gift, a loan, a grant, working extra hours, whatever that is. Include as much detail as you think is appropriate to convince your audience. Now, most of the letters that I get from this article, from this assignment rather, they're a lot of fun to read because this is where you pull out all the stops and manipulate your audiences. And we all know how to do this, whether we want to admit it or not. My favorite of all time was from a student in freshman composition. He wrote to his best friend, and his email was very simple. Hey man, remember that time I hooked you up with a hot girl at the bar? You owe me. That was the end of the email. Not exactly what I had in mind when I wrote the assignment, but it could be rhetorically effective depending on the very specific set of circumstances. So that's going to be the first half of the assignment. The second half, after you finish that email, write 2 or 3 sentences just in the same document explaining how and why you use the rhetorical appeals you read about, ethos, pathos, or logos, to make your argument, and tell me why this would be persuasive to your audience. So by this point, you have good information on making arguments, on using evidence. You're going to use that in your first paper as you get that draft ready. If you have questions about particular things, you want me to look over a paragraph or so, send me an email. If you'd like me to go over more than that, please come by office hours. Those are Tuesday, Thursdays, 4 to 6. And I will be here staring into the computer screen, waiting for someone to show up. I will see you back here for our next lecture on rhetorical appeals.